Welcome to the deep dive. So you sent us this really interesting piece, The Cult of Teen Politics by Larken Rose.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think.
It does, and we spent some time really digging into it like we do to pull out the key insights for you.
Hmm.
So our goal today is basically to unpack Rose's main arguments about, well, political hypocrisy,
Mm.
especially how it shows up in the U.S. two-party system.
Exactly. And what hits you right away is Rose isn't holding back. It's not some detached analysis.
No, definitely not.
It's a really strong critique aimed at, well, both Democrats and Republicans, which is, kind of refreshing in a way. You don't always see that balance.
Right. And the central thread, the thing that keeps popping up, is this idea that push come to shove, loyalty to the political team seems to trump, well, consistent principles for either side.
That's a big claim.
It is a powerful one. So let's dive into the specifics, the examples the article uses to, make that case.
Okay, yeah. Let's focus on that core argument first. Team loyalty versus actual principles. Rose makes this case pretty forcefully that both parties often engage in what looks like, well, straight-up hypocrisy.
Right.
Meaning they'll slam the other side for doing something
Uh-huh.
that their own party has actually done, sometimes pretty recently, too. It kind of highlights that maybe we judge our own team differently.
Yeah, like there's one set of rules for us,
Right.
a much tougher set for them. The article seems to say this goes beyond just disagreeing on policy. It points to this deeper allegiance to just being on the winning side, maybe.
That seems to be the implication. And to show this, the article looks first at examples it labels as left-wing hypocrisy. What were some of those?
Well, a big one was how Democrats criticized Trump on immigration, specifically things like deportations and tariffs.
Okay.
Rose points out that, if you look back, similar policies were actually carried out or supported under Democratic presidents.
Right.
So, the argument in the article is that the intensity of the criticism against Trump suggests maybe the outrage was more about who was president.
Than the policy itself.
Exactly. Less about a fundamental opposition to, say, deportations as a concept.
And that's a key point the article makes, isn't it? It's less about judging the policy as good or bad and more about questioning the consistency or maybe the sincerity of the criticism.
Yeah, exactly that. Because if you accepted it or even pushed for it under your own party's leader, why the sudden fury now? That's the question Rose poses.
Makes sense.
The article also hits on the Trump as authoritarian accusations from the left.
Ah, yes.
Again, Rose argues, look at history. You can find examples where Democrats backed measures that, well, could also be seen as authoritarian leaning.
So the underlying point from the article seems to be, is the real objection about the action itself or just about who is taking the action?
Precisely. And there was that really specific case mentioned, too, wasn't there, about the deportation?
Oh, right. The man deported even though a judge ruled against it?
Yes. The article frames that as a pretty clear violation of due process, Fifth Amendment stuff, something that, in theory, everyone should object to on principle.
But the implication is the outrage wasn't universal. Or maybe it depended on whose side you felt the authorities were on.
That's the suggestion, that a true commitment to a principle like due process would mean protesting any such violation, regardless of the political jerseys involved.
Okay, so that covers some of the examples aimed at the left, but the article is clear. It sees this on both sides.
Absolutely. Rose definitely turns that critical lens onto the right as well, pointing out what the article considers Republican hypocrisy. What stood out there?
Well, one pretty stark example the article brings up is how Republicans largely stuck with Trump.
Uh-huh.
Even when he implemented policies the article kind of cheekily calls socialist, like using the term Doge dividends for the stimulus checks.
Right, I remember that phrasing. It's highlighting that direct government financial aid, something Republicans usually argue against pretty strongly.
Right. When Democrats propose it, yeah. So the article asks, why the support when Trump did it? Was it principle or team loyalty?
It's that apparent contradiction again. And there was another example around spending, wasn't there?
Yeah, war spending. The article notes that Republicans often criticize Democrats for, excessive military budgets, but they mostly backed Trump's own pretty significant increases in military spending. So the article implies their opposition might be more situational, more about who's doing the spending.
Less about a consistent belief in, say, fiscal conservatism or non-interventionism.
Exactly. And connecting this back, the article seems to be arguing that these sorts of inconsistencies show a political game where maybe sticking to the party line is just more important than sticking to a fixed set of beliefs.
It becomes about power for the team, maybe over principle.
That seems to be the core argument, which leads us nicely into what the article calls double standards.
Yeah. These are some of the most, maybe, obvious examples of this alleged hypocrisy, where stated positions seem to flip-flop. What were those again?
Sure. The article highlights, for instance, Democrats often using the "my body, my choice" slogan for abortion rights.
A very prominent stance.
But then, often supporting things like vaccine mandates, which also involve bodily autonomy and government directives on health.
And on the other side.
Conversely, it points to Republicans frequently identifying as pro-life,
Right.
while also tending to support military actions or wars that inevitably result in civilian deaths, innocent lives lost.
It puts those positions side by side, and it is a stark contrast. The article really presents these not as deeply held philosophies, but more as convenient stories.
Yeah, convenient narratives is the phrase used, like the stance shifts depending on what's politically useful at that moment, rather than flowing from some consistent ethical core.
And, it does make you think about those times you see people defend their politician for something they'd absolutely rake someone else over the coals for.
You see,
Well, very human, I suppose.
it does, and this whole idea raises questions about political activity itself, like protests. The article gets into that, calling it theatrical politics.
Right. What was Rose's take on protests, particularly those against Trump?
Pretty critical, actually. The article suggests many of those protests didn't really have a coherent moral or principled basis.
Meaning they were just anti-Trump.
Sort of. The suggestion is they were often driven more by a dislike of his personality, or maybe even, the article claims, stirred up by moneyed interests to look like grassroots anger.
And the danger of that kind of focus.
It is that it distracts, right? This intense focus on us versus them, often fueled by protests, can pull attention away from the deeper problems.
Like what?
Like issues the article claims cut across party lines anyway, things like growing authoritarianism maybe, or endless wars, or corruption, stuff that gets ignored in the partisan shouting matches.
So the constant bickering keeps us from seeing the bigger picture, maybe the underlying system that both parties might actually prop up.
That's exactly the argument, which leads to a really major claim in the piece.
Which is?
The idea that both Democrats and Republicans, despite all the noise, ultimately serve the same ruling class.
Okay, unpack that. What does the article mean by ruling class?
It suggests that if you really look at the core outcomes, both parties tend to support similar fundamental things.
Such as?
Things like continuing wars, expanding government surveillance and censorship, maintaining mass incarceration, looking out for big corporate interests. The article even points to specific things like, the lack of real answers on 9/11 or the Epstein situation or the JFK files.
Implying both sides have reason to keep those things quiet.
That's the implication, yeah. A shared interest in avoiding certain kinds of scrutiny, maybe suggesting complicity that goes deeper than just party politics.
Wow. Okay, that paints a picture of a system where the public fights are maybe just for show, to keep people divided while the real power structure stays the same.
That's the picture painted, and that's where that really blunt metaphor comes in.
The one about the boot.
Yeah, you're just complaining about which boot is stomping you.
It's harsh, but it's suggesting that for the average person, maybe it doesn't matter that much which party is technically in charge.
The outcome feels similar regardless. It's a very provocative image.
It is, and it leads directly into the article's proposed solution, its call to action. So, given all this critique, what does Rose say we should do?
Well, the argument is that just swapping one party for the other isn't going to bring about real change.
Okay.
Instead, the article calls for a shift in our focus, moving away from this almost tribal party loyalty.
Towards what?
Towards core principles, really figuring out what you believe about basic things, due process, liberty, taxation, war, and then holding everyone to those standards consistently, no matter the party label.
So it's about individuals developing their own moral compass, basically, and applying it evenly, not giving your team a pass.
Exactly. And the article suggests that if enough people started doing that, started uniting around shared principles instead of party flags, then maybe that could challenge the control of this ruling class the article talks about.
That's the hope expressed in the piece, yeah. Finding common ground on fundamental values, not manufactured divisions.
Now, underlying this whole critique, the article touches on some specific philosophical ideas. We mentioned due process.
Right. The Fifth Amendment is explicitly brought up as a key principle, often ignored for political gain.
And bodily autonomy, too, right? Not just for abortion, but applied more broadly as an ethical standard.
Yes, arguing for consistency on issues like vaccine mandates as well, framing it as a fundamental principle.
And beyond those specific points, there's a kind of undercurrent, wouldn't you say? Something that feels a bit like voluntarism or maybe philosophical anarchism?
I think so, yeah. There's definitely a deep skepticism of centralized state power running through it, regardless of which party wields that power. It emphasizes voluntary action over state coercion.
A critique of the state itself, almost, rather than just the party currently running it. It values individual choice and questions top-down authority.
Definitely. Now, we also have to mention the style of the article, because the tone, the language, it's pretty intense.
That's one way to put it. Yeah, it's very direct, often sarcastic, definitely provocative.
You see it in the name-calling, right? Mango Mussolini for Trump.
Or describing voters sometimes as human livestock or politicians as mass-murdering psychopaths.
Yeah.
It's not holding back.
No. It's clearly not trying to be subtle.
And you have to assume that's intentional, right? Well, it might turn some readers off.
The goal seems to be to shock people, maybe, to shake them out of complacency and force a harder look at the system.
Yeah, a rhetorical tactic to cut through the usual noise and make people really question things.
Absolutely. It wants a reaction, even if it's disagreement. Okay, so let's try and wrap up our deep dive here. If you had to boil down the main takeaway from Larken Rose's The Cult of Team Politics, what would it be?
I think the absolute core message is a warning. A warning about how easily partisan loyalty can make us hypocritical, how it can lead us to value the team over consistent principles. The article basically argues, if your stance on an issue changes depending purely on who is in power rather than the action itself,
Then you're probably not thinking from principle.
exactly. You might be being manipulated, acting out of loyalty rather than conviction. That's the central warning.
It's a call, then, to see the two-party system as maybe an illusion of choice, and to stop acting like, as the article says, pawns in their game.
Yeah. To step back, examine your own fundamental beliefs, and demand consistency from leaders, and maybe from ourselves, too.
So turning this back to you, the listener, this article throws out some pretty big challenges. Ideas about political loyalty, hypocrisy across the board.
It asks you to consider the examples given the shifting positions on things like deportations, war spending, personal freedoms. Do those examples ring true based on what you observe?
And maybe here's a final thought to chew on, building on what the article suggests. How much does your own loyalty to a team shape your political views? And what might change, really change, if those views were grounded only in principles you applied consistently, no matter who's proposing what?
Yeah. Something to reflect on. Maybe pick an issue or two and ask yourself, would I feel the same way if the other party was doing this?
It's definitely worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.